Good morning, good morning, good morning. We're working at the Cold War this morning, and our breakdown is big ideas, organizations, events, independence, and then one you can't see online called Canadiana. There's muffins here. Mackenzie, could you close the door for me just so that we're distracted as people come in and out. Hopefully this pen is going to work pretty well. It is. So we're going to do a brief review of what the Cold War was. We're not going to put all that down. Again, this is a course about Canada. So it's really about Canada during and after the Cold War. You're not going to be expected to explain why the United States got involved in Vietnam or the nuances of the Cuban Missile Crisis or anything like that. They really will only be asking you about what Canada's role was in those areas. So it should be actually relatively easy. The hard part is when you get into this stuff is more, I think, the trivial pursuit kind of questions about things like the CRTC and stuff like that. So that's why we have a little Canadiana section towards the end. Okay? Good morning, Alex. Mr. McKinder is late. Okay, now, only I could call somebody late at 8:01 a.m. in the morning. You just walk in front of the camera. That's him. All right, there. Now, okay, off we go. So big ideas from the Cold War. Just remember the world had been, had 7 great powers before World War II, and it came down to 2 superpowers, and they were the United States and the Soviet Union. So, I mean, we can put down, I guess, you don't have to study this, so I'm just going to write it down just to remind you. It's a bipolar world with 2 superpowers. And one is communist, one is democratic and capitalist, and they become rivals when they defeat Nazi Germany and fascist Japan, if you will. Japan fascist. When the war comes to an end, you know, the old rule, what the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Well, once the enemy is gone, now we're rivals again. There's lots of reasons for that. The important part for us is, what was Canada's role in this? Well, we're the neighbor of the United States. We're a friend of the United States. And thus, we're going to find ourselves largely allied with the United States during this conflict that lasts almost 50 years. Okay? But not permanently. Canada wanted to be, and this is the big idea we ended World War II with, wanted to be a middle power. So the key point for Canada was we wanted to be a middle power. We wanted to have influence in the world, but we didn't want colonies. We weren't a country that was interested in dominating world affairs, but we wanted to have a voice and be heard. Okay? Not Britain's kid anymore. And then we've talked about it. We also didn't want to just be the United States yeah, what can we do? Okay. We wanted to be independent of that and yet be supportive of them. So that's sort of the story of Canada's politics over this time. And I'm trying to think, can you think of any other big ideas from this period of time? Maybe the fact that the world was, MAD. We called it MAD. It was mutual assured destruction. I mean, it was a new world in that, get out of here, bug, in that we now had nuclear weapons. And by the 1950s and 1960s, the United States and Soviet Union had allies, but they also had these nuclear weapons pointed at each other. And what was Canada? How did we get ourselves involved in that question? Remember, Canada really didn't want nuclear weapons on her soil for a long time. And finally, we never have our own. But finally, later in the 1960s, we started to say it was okay for a while, and we've gone back to saying it's not okay. So that was sort of how Canada mixed into that. What are the big ideas of the period? Pretty easy. Okay, we know that, and Canada's role in this rivalry. Now, the next thing I guess we could also put down on big ideas was, how could the world not have another world war? And that was the creation of the United Nations. And Canada would have an important role in the UN. So when we put organizations up, the first organization I'm going to put up will be the United Nations. And the UN was, of course, created right after the Second World War, just like the League of Nations had been created after the First World War. And the idea was to create something that would keep the peace, but also make it better for all of mankind. Remember, there were so many refugees, people struggling when that war was over, and the Holocaust had happened. So this was really a response to that, and all the countries of the world joined. But it was hard to get the great powers to join, hard to get the Soviet Union and the United States to join. because they didn't want to join something that could tell them what to do. And that's where the UN broke down into two little organizations. Well, I shouldn't say them little. The first one that Canada was always a member of was the General Assembly, and yes, I'll write, instead of writing General Ass, I'll write General Assembly. That where all countries had a voice. Everybody was a member. And then there was something else called the Security Council, and the Security Council had 5 permanent members. Canada was not one of those 5 permanent members. The 5 permanent members are the big powers. US, USSR for sure, Britain and France kind of came along for the ride, and China. And at first it was mainland China, and then when mainland China turned into communist China, that's where that whole discussion in the Korean War comes about. Are they members, aren't they? So that was how they got the US and the Soviet Union to agree to join, but each of those people in the Security Council had what kind of a power? A veto power. Great job. So that was the story of the UN. Canada's going to prove herself to really support the UN. Good morning, Danica. Now, next up, Canada joined something with just the United States called NORAD. And NORAD, and I can never remember what the acronym stands for, it's kind of a weird one. But anyways, it is the air defense system over Canada and the United States, right? You guys remember this? Yeah. They had the DEW line, which was the distant early warning line. Actually, they had a pine tree line too. Okay, so it's pine trees and DEW. These are the guys that do the Santa tracker, right? And the key idea was to defend North America against an air attack from the Soviet Union. Radar lines, and then we would work together. So this is Canada and the US together. Then we joined something called NATO. And NATO was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And this is literally like a street gang, if you will. If anybody attacks one of us, we all defend each other. Okay, it's called collective security. And that's actually not a bad term to remember. Collective security is the idea that if there's a bully, we all stand together. The UN has that as well, but that's not the only thing the UN does. We should probably add to our little UN note here. What could we add to our UN note? What are some WHO? Great job. WHO. What is WHO, guys? I should say, who is WHO? The World Health Organization, right? You know, when Brad Pitt battles zombies, he's working with WHO. I don't know, but it's true. UNICEF, that works for children. UNESCO. Those are other organizations that come out of the United Nations. The United Nations wasn't just a defensive thing. It was also about trying to eradicate disease, eradicate poverty, okay? International human rights, so it's more to it. NATO is literally all about defending Britain, France, Canada, the United States, West Germany, which was at the time quite controversial that they joined. And NATO has actually grown out and is still around. What was the opposing street gang to NATO? The Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact. So Canada's not part of the Warsaw Pact. I'll write versus the Warsaw Pact. Okay? Any other organizations we can think of right away? I'm going to add one right now that's much later. It's actually after the Cold War. It's called NAFTA. And NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement. And that was with the United States and with Mexico. And yesterday I asked a question, we're doing globalization, for everybody to look at the back of their shirts in one of my classes, and 3 students had shirts made in Mexico. And it was an example actually that, you know, those shirts that might have been made in Canada before now go to Mexico because labor's cheaper there. It was all part of the deal. When we could sell stuff to Mexico though too, it was good for us, good for BlackBerry, at least for a while. BlackBerry's kind of lost it. You guys got the idea? So those are some organizations after the Cold War for Canada. I'm probably missing some, but we'll jump to that in a second.